It's very nice to see this many people. So you want to go a round of introductions of who you are, or anyone volunteering to who you are, why you're attending this event, and what you're expecting?
Well, I think there are many people now in this, and it might take too long to
take a while
themselves. So I think you might
that I might take over and say and introduce some of the names I recognize.
People can also make comments in the chat about what they want.
Yes, that would be very nice. Because as I see in our participants, now we have colleagues from informatics. We have colleagues from business informatics. We have students taking a course in Introduction to Systems Thinking, and also students taking our systems perspective on e-health.
If I also may suggest, as you see, I have written at my name, Anita Miriamdotter, LNU, which is short for Linné University. It would be nice if you can add your affiliation so we know, since we don't know all the names of these.
Yes, that would be very nice.
So can you do that? Can you actually change the affiliation?
Yes, you know, if you go on your screen where you are in focus, there to the upright, there are 3 dots at my screen. So if you click on them, on that, you get at the end, you get rename, and there you can add or change or whatever.
Got it.
So a lesson in Zoom.
Hi everyone. Sorry about that. We had a time mix-up or something.
Yes, but are you ready?
Yeah, I think so.
Okay, but then I will ask if it's okay to record this first part of the event.
Yes, absolutely.
Thank you. Wait, I have to first, before I forget, make you a co-host, so you have all the rights that you need.
Okay.
And then I will do like that.
Recording in progress.
Before
Recording in
letting
progress.
you start, I also want to inform about the 2022 International Cornell University Systems Thinking Conference that will be taking place on 12th and 13th of May. I will provide a link with more information in the chat for those of you who are interested. And now the scene is yours, so please.
Excellent. Well, thanks for having me, and thanks for setting this up. In the next 2 hours or so, we're going to give kind of one continuous thing, but it's really 3 different parts. And you could think of it as 3 separate talks, one on kind of the future of the field, just some insights on that. The next on DSRP theory and the simple rules that sort of underlie systems thinking. And finally, on developing kind of a pragmatic daily practice, which is, I guess we call the workshop. So So first, I want to dive into talk a little bit about the future of the field of systems thinking, because many here are doctoral students, or you will literally be responsible for the field in the future. And I want to provide what I hope will be some guiding thoughts or guardrails for where I personally think we should be focusing. And I also have a somewhat of a hidden agenda in that is that I'm really quite fond of the field and I would like it to survive, but it's on its current trajectory. I think survival is a bit of a hypothesis and it's not necessarily assured. So take this first bit as a few thoughts on how we might increase the probability of survival of the field of systems thinking. And you can see that, correct?
Yes.
You can see my slides and everything.
Yes.
Okay, good. Just a note on terminology. By systems thinking, I really do mean to focus on the idea that systems thinking is not the same as systems science. Kind of common terms that are used versus slightly more scientific terms would be, thinking would be equivalent to cognition, which includes emotion and conation. Systems thinking would be equivalent to cognitive complexity, and systems science would be equivalent to material complexity. So just as a terminology thing, I'm not necessarily talking about systems science, although it's massively related. So I first want to talk about crisis and opportunity. There was a bunch of words there that Sadaf read, which probably sounded like a word salad, but it'll make more sense as I jump into them, all those different words. I think we're living in a time of crises, from COVID to Ukraine to the unrest to global political and financial instability, social injustice, cultural and political divisiveness, and even environmental degradation. So we have plenty of crises to deal with. And in our lifetimes, I think certainly not in my lifetime, there's not been a time more steeped in the need for systems thinking. The current crises we face also present unique opportunities to the field of systems thinking. And like I said, there's never been a time before in human history, I think, like the present, to show us why it's so critical that systems thinking be more readily and easily adopted. We see the incredible power, for example, of mental models and reality, and the importance of matching those two things up, mental models and reality, and the dire consequences when they don't get matched up. And we see this in the spread of coronavirus as a disease. We also see it in the spread of misinformation, which structurally follow very similar dynamical systems. And of course, we see this same issue in the Ukraine, and we see the immense power of, excuse me, of mental models, and the direct cause they have on behavior and the dangers of a mismatch. And in these crises, there is opportunity to advance the field of systems thinking and work towards a more perfect world where human conscious awareness is more in alignment with reality. This, I think, is the promise and the popularity of systems thinking. And based on this promise, the field has had many fits and starts in different areas and at different times. It's ebbed and flowed and waned in its popularity. Whether it be the Sengi work in the 80s that was massively popular, at least on this side of the pond. And we can and should rise to meet both the popularity and the promise of systems thinking. But if we're to be honest with ourselves, I think systems thinking as a field has not really met this promise nor justified this popularity. As a field, we often fail to deliver on this popularity and promise because we cannot provide utility at an advanced technical level, nor do we really provide clarity and accessibility to newcomers in the field. So I think the promise is related to advanced utility, and the popularity is related to novice accessibility. These twin goals should be on the mind of all leaders in the systems thinking field, I think, because systems thinking is not entirely like physics or chemistry or biology, although it is like them. The advanced application of those things can serve all of humanity. So you can have a very small group of people doing advanced applications in those things and serve all of humanity. But for systems thinking to truly work, it can't be something that only advanced experts use. It has to be something that all people apply. The current crises that I just spoke of, like COVID and others, have shown us this, right? If the average Joe can't understand the negative systemic effects, then their behavior will become those negative systemic effects. So just having systems thinking be accessible to experts is not enough. It has to be accessible. It has to be utilizable by experts with very difficult problems, but it also has to be something that's accessible to everyday people for everyday problems. So in the workshop that follows this, we'll show you and focus on daily practice of systems thinking, how to create daily reps, what we call reps, repetitions, and what to focus on to develop expert level systems thinking skills. Does that make some sense so far? So hitting on universality and diversity, and this is something that we've written on quite a bit. It's my firm belief that the future of the systems thinking field is in search of universality or consilience. And note that I said the search, not necessarily the finding. I think just the search alone for universality will transform the field. And the finding obviously would be a great thing, although that will be very important to find it. But the field will be transformed when we search for universals that underlie systems of all kinds. And so I want to hit on this idea of universality and diversity, or what we sometimes call plurality, because I think we have it totally wrong in three areas. The field has debated universality and diversity, or pluralism, as mutually exclusive for long enough. As we recently wrote, the fourth wave, I think, is here. Not only are these two ideas not mutually exclusive, they're twin ideas, the same side of the different sides of the same coin, and they're really inseparable. And number two, the field has made the mistake, and I too made the mistake early in my career, that the plurality is the plurality of systems thinking methods. And I no longer think that's the case. I think the plurality is the plurality of different systems, the different systems that all people are interested in, not merely the population dynamic models of SD or stakeholder systems of SSM or socio-technical systems of CST. The plurality isn't our opinion methods. The plurality is all of science, all of knowledge, all of humanity's mental models. Any person, any system, every person, every system. We see here a graph of in this case, DSRP research across the disciplines, the beginnings of what will eventually be quite a large meta-analytic study where the N is growing. And so the point is that the diversity isn't necessarily systemic methods. The diversity is all the very diverse types of systems that exist in the world. And finally, the third thing is that universality has a maturing effect on fields of study and disciplines of science. And systems thinking is, I think, arguably no different. The history of science itself is sort of our case precedence for the idea that universals help fields to gain maturity. If physics had not sought out grand theory, it'd still be largely metaphysics characterized by mystical ether or metaphorical elements of polyhedra. Fields of knowledge, kind of like children, go through a natural maturation process. The mature program of physics was born as metaphysics until it found its way through modern theories like Newton and Einstein. And, the handsome devil that we call chemistry today was born of alchemy. If it had not sought out universal patterns, it probably still would be alchemy. And if biology had not sought out universal patterns in Darwin and Mendel and Watson and Crick, it still would largely be a field dominated by kind of a form of biological stamp collecting, stuffing specimens in jars and having great diversity, but no underlying universality. Another way of saying this is it's time for systems thinking as a field to grow up, to move out of our parents' basement, to get a job. In short, to be more responsible and accountable. And I think we have to hold ourselves as scholars and as academics, but first and foremost as scientists, we have to hold ourselves accountable and be responsible. And the question is, how do we do that? And I think in systems thinking, we're fairly accustomed to the reality that each scholar or practitioner proposes their own particular flavor of systems thinking. In effect, it's sort of an endless sea of opinion. And indeed, this is in many ways how we currently define the diversity or the plurality. It's all these different methods, and it's a plurality of systems thinking methods. And I think here lies the problem. First, that it's true, and second, that we accept it as normal. Imagine if we said something similar in the fields of physics or biology or chemistry or even psychology and sociology. It would be very strange, right? Each scholar or practitioner proposes their own particular flavor of, let's say, gravity or something like that. So I think we have to change from fewer frameworks and opinions to more accumulated evidence and theory. And that kind of brings us to brings me to my final point on the future part, and that is the need for evidence and theory. We need more evidence and more theory. That is, we need more testable hypotheses that can accumulate evidence and mature into theories, which have, by definition, accumulated evidence. And this will require, I think, a sea change in the field towards evidence-based and empirical work in systems thinking and cognitive complexity. Not that we're against opinion and debate. To the contrary, I support opinion and debate, but we're against confusing opinion with evidence. Empirically based findings that are made transparent and accessible to the general public have to become the norm rather than the exception in systems thinking. And DSRP theory currently has a burgeoning amount of evidence to support it, and I'll share some of that later. But there could be many other theories, many other universal theories that come along and let the best theory win. As far as I'm concerned, that's always sort of worked out well for science. So generally speaking, this will require two critically important insights to get to evidence and theory-based field. And I think they're represented by this table relatively well as a research program for the field, where we look at both basic and applied research in cognitive and material complexity. So the two on the top and the two on the left. And the interchange between what is real and what we think, which is sort of the crux of systems thinking. And this table causes us to ask sort of three basic questions of any hypothesis, of any model or framework or opinion. And these are the same questions that we ask DSRP theory has led to it being, validated theoretically. Does blank exist in the mind, right? Does whatever framework exist as a universal, material, observable, cognitive phenomena? Does it exist in nature? Does it exist as a material, observable phenomena? And on the effectiveness side, is awareness of it or metacognition, does it increase effectiveness, right? Does it increase the ability to think more cognitive complexity, to be more in alignment or in parallelism with real world complexity, to get it right more often, essentially. So that's the first thing, the existence and efficacy of research in mind and nature. And the second bit is equally important, and that is that all of this is on an empirical basis. These questions and the answers have to be built on a foundation of evidence such that we can ask ourselves, do hypotheses lead to an accumulation of evidence that build theories? That is, we need to ask ourselves these questions, especially about all of our beloved models, right? Especially our most popular but untested models, which we've taken as gospel without subjecting them to empirical scrutiny. We assert that many of the most commonplace models of systems thinking are, at current, not really much more than opinion or opinion guesses. And so that requires a second bit, which is we need to establish what we mean by evidence. So it is true that academic and scholarship can be overly reductionistic. There's no doubt about that, and there's certainly a long history of that. And it's a credit to our field that we saw this and have pushed science in this direction. So we should be careful about how we define evidence and what kinds of methodological choices are made based on the condition of knowledge. And Laura and I have developed a systemic approach to research methods and knowledge called what we call the KMMM, the Knowledge Method Matching Matrix, for this purpose. And we don't have time today to go into it, but suffice to say that its purpose is to decrease kind of the reductio ad absurdum that we see in some academic circles in publishing, and especially in the advice that we give to doctoral students. So, and we certainly see that, and we have seen that, and lots of systems thinkers have pointed that out. So I don't think that evidence means, you know, I'm sure that I'll get lots of criticism from this talk about I'm a reductionist or something like that, which is absurd, of course. But I believe that reductionism and holism work together, and certainly systems thinking has been very influential in that. So in a nutshell, the opportunity and crisis we are presented with today both energizes and exemplifies the promise and popularity of the field, which has failed to sort of materialize both in terms of advanced utility and novice accessibility. So it's kind of going around this cycle. And this is in large part due to an ongoing dualism or debate or confusion about universality and diversity, and the need to take academic, scholarly, scientific, and leadership responsibility and accountability of the field to adequately produce evidence and theory to help us rise to meet these unique opportunities and crises. So I hope that this kind of brief overview of what we see as the state of the field is helpful, because I think it's really important that we move in a direction that's at least has some commonalities to it, and hopefully that thinking will perhaps grab the ideas of a doctoral student or something like that. So I want to switch gears to the second part of today, which is kind of just hitting on systems thinking, what we call systems thinking made simple. The purpose of which is to get what you think to match what is real, which I actually think is in the name of systems thinking itself, right? It's systems and cognition. So I just got a notice that somebody's raising their hand.
Yeah, it's me, Derek. It's Gerald.
Oh, hey, Gerald.
Hi. I'm just wondering if you want to take questions in between these two bits, or whether you want to just go ahead and then take them later.
I think we could do it either way. It might, if we go off on a bunch of questions, then we might not have enough time to finish. But okay. I'm always okay with not finishing.
That's okay. I'll hold off.
Okay. Okay. Good. Let's see. Systems thinking made simple. What was I saying? Yeah, that's about what I was saying, right? So this is kind of like just a very simple graph that just talks about like our the two courses that we teach primarily here at Cornell. One is in systems thinking and mapping, and that leads into systems leadership. Today, I'll just talk about these bottom two gray bars, which really focus on, again, what you think matching what is real, which I propose is really the essence of what systems thinking is about. This is really what our research lab studies. And the reason being is that when what you think matches what is real, or you increase the probability of that match, the decisions you make work out the way you think they're going to work out, right? Just think about that for a second. When what we think is in alignment or matches or fits what is real, then the decisions we make, the behaviors we take, work out the way we think they're going to work out, the way we think they're going to happen. So seems really simple, but it's hard to do. Another way of saying that is cognitive complexity fits material complexity. So, and we need to increase this fit. We need to find better ways to increase the fit. And that's kind of the gist of it. Now, material complexity sounds really, heady and stuff like that, but really it's, they're just systems, right? All the different systems we care about. And that stuff like our family, our kids, our country, our business, our work, our customers, our products, whatever it is that we care about, that's material complexity, right? So now I'm sure are familiar with Daniel Kahneman's work. If not, he won the Nobel Prize. And we have really two powerful thinking modes. One is system one. It's fast. It's the one we use, 95% of the time. It's intuitive. It's emotional. It's autonomic. It happens without us even really telling it to happen. And it only has a tiny little downside, which is that it's prone to error. And there's system two, which is serial, looped thinking. It's metacognitive, it's aware, it's systemic, it's evidence or information feedback based, and it's slow, but it's more accurate, right? And the upside to system one thinking is that it's fast. The downside is that it's wrong a lot. And the upside to system two is that it's more accurate more of the time. The downside is that it's slow. And our research shows that 4 thinking habits, these DSRP habits, plus repetition, can increase the speed and accuracy of thinking. And this gives you a third option, which is, I think, possible, which is fast and right. And I don't mean right like, perfectly right. I just mean more accurate, increasing the probability of more accuracy and less bias. So fast and accurate. Does that make some sense? Okay. So what I want to do is share with you a study that we did recently, a few studies that just give you a flavor for what we've done. This was called the fish tank study, where we showed people a fish tank and we asked them to describe what they see, right? That's it. That's all we asked. And then we showed them a less than 1 minute read of D, S, R, and P, but each group only got one, and a bunch of different groups got different treatments in D, S, R, and P. And this is the less than 1 minute. They just read a few paragraphs. And then we asked them again to describe what they saw. And we did this for D, we did this for S, we did this for R, relationships, and we did this for P, perspectives. And these are the results. This is one dimension of 8 different dimensions. This was with a sample of 1,500 people, and it showed with high statistical significance that if we focus on DSRP habits, we get these results. People exposed to less than 1 minute of the D or S or R or P pattern of thinking or rule significantly improved the complexity and the robustness of their thinking. So you can imagine if that happens with 1 minute, if you took a more formal training, you know, you'd get even better results. That means that in a minute of training, people saw more of what was in the picture, and they saw it in many cases better. They exhibited more sophistication, more depth. They saw more that was unseen. They saw more of what others tend to miss. They saw more perspectives. They were more systemic in their thinking and created more meaning. And not just more, but better. They had better analyses, better problem solving, even better emotional intelligence and analytical intelligence. And that's for D, S, R, and P there. So you can just see the pretty clear results. This is another study we did with 35,000 people that showed that that when trying to think through something, and this was pretty interesting, 48% of people, when asked to just think about something, kind of freeze up. 48%. So that's half. And that, I think, if you think about your own experiences, it certainly aligns with my own anecdotal experiences of people kind of freeze up and don't know what to do. 48% freeze up and end up really doing nothing. And among those who do something, these are the things that they do. So they make distinctions, and then you can see it just goes down, 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 down to perspective taking. Some 25% of the people who did something, so that's 25% of 50%, actually distinguish their relationships or take perspectives or distinguish their perspectives. So that's sort of an interesting bit of research. And so from that, we can learn what people tend to do. This is what they tend to do on the left and what they tend not to do on the right. And so if we just keep doing what's on the left there and do more of what's on the right, we can increase effectiveness. In another study, this one with 1,059 sample, we see something interesting about systems thinking competence and confidence. We actually see a Dunning-Kruger effect. So what they think in terms of confidence and what their competence is mismatched. So they actually have more confidence than competence across systems thinking skills, which, if you think about it, is kind of terrifying, right? You don't want people to have more confidence than they have competence. I don't, at least. All right, so these are just a few of the studies. I can show you lots more, but just to give you a sense of it. Maybe we should take questions, because I'm not sure. You know, we might not remember them when we get to the end of this. Take a few questions.
Anyone with questions? Please turn on your microphone or raise your hand or write in the chat. Gerald, please go ahead.
Yeah, so am I off? Yeah, good. Well, just two little things. One is I'm not sure how many people in the audience actually know DSRP, so you might want to just go through what the distinction systems, relationships, and perspectives are. So that's just an aside if you want to pick that up. But the question I had was about that framework where you were showing the progression from individual opinions through to evidence from questions and interviewing through to experimental design to meta-analysis as increasingly powerful evidence. And I've got a question about whether actually the questioning and interviewing type evidence is actually stronger than experimental design. Now, the reason I'm saying this is because I've seen so much work in economics, looking at trade-off decision making, and you put people in a lab doing making trade-off decision making on issues they don't really care that much about, they're quite able to go into slow thinking. They don't get emotionally so entangled in it because they don't really care, and they come out and it looks like that the trade-off methodologies, like I can't remember the name of it. There's various ones of them. They look very successful in the lab, and then you take them out into the real world, and people shout at each other. So it's not good evidence for that kind of to test that kind of methodology. It's better evidence actually to interview the participants.
Yeah, I would get away entirely. I don't disagree with you, Gerald. I think I would get entirely away from which is stronger, which is better, that type of thing. I think what this graph is trying to show us is that the condition of knowledge should help us to determine the methodology that we choose. So experimental methods are great, but they often aren't possible, and we often utilize them prematurely when, for example, interviewing methods would be much more illustrative and much more helpful in terms of learning new things, especially when the condition of knowledge is very low and you don't have construct validity, for example, to do an experiment. Oftentimes we're doing experiments prior to having any kind of deep construct validity, or we're doing experiments in a way that is so disembodied from the real world that we're doing like an X causes Y analysis, but we've removed it from the real world. And that's that reductio ad absurdum kind of stuff that I think systems thinking legitimately has criticized about certain approach. I wouldn't say science. I don't think that's science. I think that's the practice of science, which is extremely flawed, as we all know. So I wouldn't say that one is stronger or not stronger. I would say that it's sort of situational. I think interviewing techniques, I mean, when we think of the poster children of science, if you were going to create posters of great scientists, you'd put Darwin, Einstein, Jane Goodall, for sure, would be three of them. Well, Jane Goodall sat in the bush and observed, didn't do any experiments or anything. Darwin did a few little experiments, but most of his stuff was observational. And Einstein did Gundankin experiments and never actually did any real experimentation. So for us to say that the sort of bread and butter of science is experimental design is just an absurdity of history. And there are lots and lots of different things. But what we want to do is build the condition of knowledge high enough so that we can do some of these more specific scalpel level methodologies, which are powerful if the condition of knowledge is ready for them. Does that answer your question a little bit?
Yep.
Or yeah.
Yep.
So I agree with you that interview techniques are incredibly strong, and we often misguide doctoral students, to get published and to do experimental stuff when the condition of knowledge in a particular area about a particular thing is low. We shouldn't be doing that. We should be doing observation and lit reviews and interviews and surveys or whatever. Sometimes you can't interview sheep, but things like that. Other questions?
Yes. I wanted to ask you about the you presented Daniel Kaufman, I think his name was, Thinking Fast and Thinking Slow. Yeah, actually we got that book as a Christmas present some years ago by our, at that time, head of department. And I read the book. It's interesting way of presenting how our brain works. But I don't remember that much of it yet now. But you mentioned then that these were two ways of thinking, and which was not. And then that you mentioned that if you think about DSRP, you have four ways of thinking: distinctions, structures, relationship perspectives. But so can you which will be fast and right. So can you expand a bit on that? Because I think also when you presented some of your studies, I got the understanding that when you think fast, when you see, then you distinguish. That's what the first thing. So how do you mean that this will then sort of combine this, both thinking fast and thinking slow and correct?
Yeah, that's a great question, and it's the best way that I can explain it is a little bit. If you look at what militaries do, or you look at like star athletes, what they do is they practice, right? They practice things, and as a result of that practice, then they can go into very adaptive, very fast-paced environments like sports or like, literally war, which you can't imagine a more adaptive, chaotic, VUCA-like environment that the person has to adjust to constantly, right? So you have to think fast, and the downsides are quite serious. So you have to, like, you lose, or you could be injured or die. And so you have to get it right? Or bad things happen. So in that case, what you do is you essentially have repetition. So the question is, in thinking, what is the thing that we're repeating, right? Because when we go into a situation where we need to be adaptive and fast and on our feet, we don't know what that situation is going to be, right? So what is the repetition that we're going to do? And the repetition is the structural patterns that DSRP give you. So if you practice distinction, systems, relationship, and perspectives as structural patterns, you actually burn the neurons to be very, very fluid and capable and flexible with those structural patterns. And as a result, when you get in a situation where you have to think right and fast, or right and slow, it doesn't really matter, but then you're more readily available. You have that structural ability, that structural capacity. So what you're practicing, or what you're doing the reps in, repetition, reps, is structural thinking. You're burning the pathways that you can make, you can break things down into parts. You can relate the parts. You can distinguish the relationship. You can break down the relationship that you distinguished into parts, and you can take perspectives from any one of those parts. And that takes some practice to be good at that, to be not only good at it, but aware of it. And that metacognitive awareness, there's a tremendous amount of studies in metacognition that show that metacognition really helps us succeed in all domains. So it's a combination of structural ability, of structural thinking patterns, and metacognitive awareness. And that will get us to be able to think fast or slow and more accurately, less biased.
Okay, thank you. Then I understand.
Yeah. So along those lines, and along the lines of what Gerald said, which is some of you might not be familiar with DSRP, we'll dive into what is DSRP all about. I'll just share with you, before I became a scientist or an academic, I spent 20 years as a mountain guide. And that's, to be honest, that's where I learned systems thinking. I learned it from nature and being out in nature 250 days a year in a tent, guiding people up the mountains of the world. And if I was to sort of summarize what I learned in one single idea from the mountains, it would be to love reality. And I say learn to love reality. What I mean by that is actually fall in love with what is real. Even when what is real, hurts or makes you mad or makes you sad or makes you frustrated, when it makes you feel things you don't want to feel. And that means paying attention to all the different signs around you. And it means paying particular attention to the bias inside of you, to be aware of what you desperately want to be true. No one, for example, wants to be lost on the side of a mountain. Everything in you wants to sort of at least pretend that everything's okay. But remaining calm and embracing the truth of your situation is the best remedy for getting out of that situation. In fact, we mountaineers have a saying, which is the truth will set you free, but first it'll piss you off. So when the reason I say this is that we know that we can teach you, for example, how to think structurally, systemically. That's actually quite simple, but it's actually very difficult to get someone to want to know what reality is, to actually test that their mental models are accurate, right? Because a lot of times we have what's called confirmation bias and that type of thing. So that's the first step. The second thing that I would share with you is understanding CAS, which is called a complex adaptive system, or CAS, because CASs are extremely important. And mostly because most of what we care about, including, and this is important, thinking itself, is a CAS. It's a complex adaptive system. So our families are CASs, our societies are CASs, our workplaces are CASs, and thinking is a CAS. So if we want to understand thinking, we have to understand CAS. And so let me share with you what I mean by CAS and give you an example. If I were to kick a ball 3 times the same way, that ball will do the same thing all 3 times if I kicked it exactly the same way, right? And we could map out what it did, follows the laws of physics, and those would be very, very complicated, a whole board of differential equations and things like that. Very complicated what's actually happening, but not actually complex. And believe it or not, to a scientist, complicated and complex are not the same thing. In the general public, they're thought of as synonymous, but they're actually quite different to a scientist. So the ball is doing a lot of complicated stuff. Now, take a dog. I have 3 of these Bernese mountain dogs here. And I'm not advocating that you kick a dog, but if you kick the dog, the first time you kick a dog, it maybe cowers. The second time you kick it, it stands its ground, maybe growls at you. Third time you kick it, it lunges forward, bites you, right? That's an example of an adaptive system. That's a system that's adapting. You're giving it the same stimulus, but you're getting a different response. So those kind of systems are quite baffling to us. And in fact, they've been baffling for like 2,500 years. We've thought all kinds of crazy things about what makes them operate. And I want to show you one type of system here called that's a CAS, which is the birds, flocking birds. These are about 100,000 starlings, and they're all going to the left here. And then in the time it takes me to say this sentence, they're all flying back to the right. And you can imagine like how difficult that must be. And like I said, since the time of Aristotle, since the time of Lao Tzu, we've been looking up into the skies and looking into the oceans and seeing these systems and wondering, how do they work, And mostly we came up with the answer, which is, well, there must be some A-type personality leader bird, which is orchestrating everything, right? It's leadership. It's telling everybody what to do. Of course, there's not enough time in the system for the message to perturbate through the system. So that can't be right. But it turns out that these systems actually are based, what's actually happening is that they follow simple rules, that the agents, which are in this case birds or fish, but they could be people or governments or organizations or whatever. An agent's just kind of a generic thing that has agency or semi-autonomous agency. They're following really simple rules. And in the case of these systems, we can program them, we can code them, and we can actually see what the simple rules are just by only putting in those simple rules and looking at the behavior that results. So here's an example of this system. And the 3 simple rules in this case are, you align with your nearest neighbors, right? So you point in the same direction and you maintain the same distance, some distance X, right? So that means like if 2 birds are coming in like this, they co-adjust. One doesn't go this way or the other go this way. They kind of co-adjust to each other locally. And you've got 3 or 4 little neighbors that you're paying attention to. And you get this remarkable behavior. It's called self-organizing behavior. So there's no leadership. It's self-organizing. It's self-organizing, right? There's no leadership. And then the third rule is avoid predators. So you see this guy come in and they all run away, and then they follow rule 1 and 2 and rule 3, and different birds or different agents in the system are following different rules at different times. It's very dynamical. And if you tried to capture all this in anything but a model, you wouldn't be able to. The differential equation kind of blows up on this. They're very difficult, but we can model them and see the result. So you can see a predator going through that system, et cetera, et cetera. So the point of these systems is that the system behavior is an emergent property of the agents and the simple rules. And so ironically, or somewhat surprisingly, underneath complexity is simplicity. And that, again, this is another place where people get a little confused because they go, well, so you're telling me complicated is not the same as complex. And then you're telling me that simple is not only related to complex, it's absolutely essential, right? That complex things underneath have simple rules. And that's exactly what I'm telling you. And so if we were to sort of simplify this, we can say that the micro multiplied makes the macro. The micro multiplied makes the macro. And you can imagine that there's so many of these interactions between any individual birds that it's very hard to figure out all the different interactions. But all those interactions, there's no mystery in it. There's no mystery in the emergent property. There's just a shit ton of interactions, right? That's a technical term, a shit ton. A lot of interactions, right? Just so many interactions, it's hard to, comprehend how many interactions there are because each individual is just paying attention to the little guys around him. So what does this mean for us to focus on things like these systems? And what it means is that when we want to intervene in these systems, we should intervene below the line, not above the line. Intervening above the line is like throwing a rock or even a whole boulder into the ocean. It makes absolutely no effect. Because there's all kinds of dampening and things like that. But if we intervene below the line, if we change the agents, or if we change the mental models of the agents, the simple rules that they're following, then we can have a huge effect. And of course, we're seeing this in real time in COVID, because we can see different agents with different mental models, and then we can see the emergent properties of their behavior in the death count, the hospitalization rate, all these different emergent properties of the system. And it's all based on individual mental models: wear a mask, don't wear a mask, 6 feet, no 6 feet, get vaccinated, don't get vaccinated, whatever. We multiply all those simple rules and we get the emergent properties of the system. Does that make sense? So the world is complex. We often think of the world as sort of complicated, but that complexity is really based on simple rules. And so that CAS actually makes the world VUCA. And for systems thinkers, this idea of VUCA is just that it's volatile, uncertain, complex, and ambiguous. Now, a lot of people would say, well, that's a real problem. Well, that's not a problem. VUCA is not a problem. VUCA is a reality. Remember I said we have to fall in love with reality? We have to fall in love with VUCA because VUCA is a reality. It makes sort of no difference whether you like VUCA or don't like VUCA. VUCA is reality. The problem is, here's the problem. The problem is that our thinking tends to be what I call, and again, this is another technical term, LAMO, right? Linear, anthropocentric, mechanistic, and ordered, right? And it's this mismatch between a VUCA world and a LAMO kinds of thinking that really messes us up. And so again, we'll focus on, well, how do we reconcile this mismatch? Because it's the mismatch that causes all kinds of problems. Let me give you a few examples, which I'm sure as systems thinkers you're familiar with. The real world is dynamic, it's adaptive, it's organic, and it's constantly evolving. Yet we tend to think very mechanistically. We say even our metaphors, the universe is like a clock, definitely isn't. The brain is like a computer, definitely is not like a computer at all. In fact, most people that are working on the cutting edge of computers are trying to get them to be more like brains. So the brain is nothing like a computer. Those are all terrible metaphors. The real world is multivalent by nature, right? And both can be true. Yet our thinking is sort of needlessly bivalent. It's a very either or kind of mutual exclusivity. The real world is networked and nested and complex, and it has a sprinkling of randomness in it. Yet we tend to think of things in ordered categories and static hierarchies. So that's problematic. Read all these textbooks and they tell you, you know, like, oh, it's a pyramid. Don't trust pyramids, except in Egypt. The real world is nonlinear, and it includes feedback and webs of causality. You know, there's no single cause in the entire world. Yet we talk about causality as if there's X causes Y. And we even encourage doctoral students to do stuff like that. Yet we think in these very linear causal ways, even though the rule, not the exception, the rule is webs of causality. And the real world is agnostic to human endeavors. It doesn't care. We're very small and insignificant, yet we tend to look at things through a very anthropocentric or human-centered lens. Our world sort of centers around us. And our brain is actually designed to get that wrong, and to think very human-centered anthropocentrically. But the real world, you know, isn't human-centered or anthropocentric. So systems thinking requires us to sort of unlearn some of these lame-o types of thinking and mindsets, and practice simple rules that underlie the complexity, the emergent property of systems thinking. And that's really critically important. Systems thinking itself is not a stepwise process. Systems thinking cannot be thinking of any kind. Complex cognition cannot be reduced to a stepwise process. What it can be reduced to is a set of simple rules that interact with each other in very, very complex and dynamical ways to create emergent complex cognition, right? And these four simple rules that underlie both cognitive and material complexity are, like I said, very simple, but the way that they operate is nothing like simple. It's very, very complex. So there are distinctions, systems, relationships, and perspectives. And importantly, when you dive into get really technical with DSRP, the elements which are below them become really important. But for now, you don't have to worry about the elements. You can just remember distinct D, S, R, and P, distinction, systems, relationships, and perspectives. But distinctions are made up of identity other, systems are made up of part whole, relationships, all of them are made up of action and reaction, and perspectives are made up of point and view, right? And so that's what DSRP is. It's simple rules that underlie the self-organizing aspect of the human mind and systemic or complex cognition. So the question that we're asking ourselves is, how is information organized in real world systems and in our mental models of those systems? That's really fundamentally the question that DSRP theory answers. And this is how it answers it. The way that information is and is not bounded, arranged, interconnected from frames of reference determines what exists and what we think exists. So there's the D and the S and the R and the P. And like I said, it's not stepwise. It's not do D first, then S, then R, then P. There are four simple rules. They're like the rules of the birds, right? Like align, distance, avoid predators. They could all be happening and do all happen simultaneously, and they all dynamically interact with each other in every thought, every moment of every day. A lot of people will even say like, oh, this is interesting, maybe I'll adopt this. You don't really get a choice of whether or not you do DSRP any more than you get a choice of whether or not you're going to be exposed to gravity today. You're doing DSRP whether you like it or not. What you get a choice in is whether or not you're aware of it. And that metacognitive awareness can make a huge difference. Make sense? All right, so just hit on the importance of mental models real quick. That's something that has been around in systems thinking for a very long time. Mental models, there's a bias that we call reality bias, which is critically important. I think it's the grandfather or grandmother of all biases. And it basically is that we're unaware of our mental models. That we don't interact with the real world directly, but indirectly through our mental models. And believe it or not, lots of folks don't even consider that they have mental models, and that's reality bias. So bringing mental models into the picture is really critically important. Once we've done that, we can start what we call the DSRP or systems thinking loop, which is to test our mental models against reality. Right? And once we test our models against reality, we take the feedback from reality and adjust our mental models, right? And a curious thing happens at that point, often to many of us humans, and that is this comic, one of my favorites, kind of captures that. What's the mountain goat doing up here in the cloud, right? And that is called confirmation bias. Confirmation bias is actually the opposite of systems thinking. So if you think about systems thinking is the process of DSRPing your mental models to the reality of DSRP and fitting your mental models to reality, whereas confirmation bias is doing the exact same thing except in reverse. It's fitting the real world to our mental models, right? So when we fit the real world to our mental models, we get confirmation bias. When we fit our mental models to the real world, we get systemic looped thinking, right? Make sense? And if we go in the right direction, we get incremental improvement over time. So that would cause us to really focus on, okay, well, these mental models are pretty important. We got to really look at the mental models because they're driving behavior and they're driving emergent properties and all kinds of other stuff. And they themselves are a complex system. So what we realize is that mental models is made up of two different parts: information, which is coming from the real world, data, whatever you want to call it, and organization or structure or thinking or cognition. And that organization is made up of these four rules. That's how we organize information. And so if we take those two ideas, information and organization, and understand that that's what's making up mental models, we can call that thinking, we can call that encoding, sometimes we call it encoding, sometimes we refer to it as cognition or structuring or DSRP. And so what we're saying is that information plus structure, organization, is what makes meaning mental models, right? Meaning is the same as mental models, predictions, decisions, behavior, same basic idea, right? So information alone isn't what gives us meaning. Information structured or organized in a particular way using these simple rules is what gives us meaning. So let me give you a quick example so this makes some sense to you and brings it down to something basic. Woman without her man is helpless, right? Versus woman without her man is helpless. So you have the same information, but very different meaning because we organized it slightly differently, right? And this one, I like to eat grandpa, I like to eat grandpa, right? Same thing. The way we organize information changes its meaning or gives it meaning in a sense. So going back to this organization and information, D, S, R, and P are the simple rules that we use to organize information. And it also turns out that they are used by nature. And this gets a little more complex, but generally speaking, DSRP is not just happening in the mind, it's happening in nature. And we have lots and lots of research that shows this and examples of this. And so the whole point of systems thinking is sort of to increase the probability of a match And by practicing DSRP structures and navigating them and matching them up against nature, against reality. By nature, I don't mean like backpacking in the woods. I mean anything. The cities are nature, because they're just building towers to the sky, just like termites build towers to the sky, right? So nature just means reality, right? Is to increase the probability between one's mental models and nature or reality. Yeah, and this really is where systems thinking, I think, gets its name. Is we're trying to understand systems, and we're doing it with this device called thinking. And that's really kind of in a nutshell what DSRP is about. So I'll stop there and answer any questions that you have about DSRP and anything like that, and then we'll dive into like, okay, how do you practice this stuff on a daily basis? Make it part of how do you get those reps in and all that kind of stuff.
Thank you, Derek. Any questions or comments? I have a question.
Yes.
I was thinking the table you had with the competence and confidence before. Now I'm going back a bit. There was a difference in some of, for the DSRMP, some of them you could see that the confidence was higher and the competence was lower. Do you have any thoughts, or do you know why some of these, the differences, why each, now I don't remember it, why, for instance, the distinctions were higher in relation to systems, and how come the difference in between these were higher in, I think it was perspectives. You had higher confidence in perspective, but actually lower competence.
Yeah. We don't know why we don't know why the differences. We know that there are differences, but we don't know why they are different. It's a good question. It's a question that would be really interesting to answer.
Yeah.
But the classic example is like we had a training once. I think in some country, and we there's tables of people, right? And they got their results back from the STMI, which is this test of systems thinking. And the guy at the table is with his team, and he goes, "Oh my God, my perspective taking competence score is so low." And everybody at the table's like, "Yeah, no shit, John. Like, you're terrible at perspective taking, right?" But John didn't he didn't really realize that he wasn't very good at perspective taking. He thought he was pretty good, but everybody around him kind of knew that he was not so great at it. So
I thought it was very interesting, and I think as it was perspective that had the highest difference in between.
No, it'd be very interesting to understand why that is. Is there something fundamentally about relationships or perspective that makes them slightly more differential than D and S?
Yeah. Thank you.
Yeah.
Gerald, you raised your hand.
Yeah. Forgive me if I just take a little bit of time to unfold this question, because so it's not misunderstood. But you talked about earlier the important thing is about aligning the thinking with the material world, so to get real, if you like. Mm-hmm. And that really has been a classic sort of strand of thinking throughout systems. I mean, you can go back to Bateson in the 50s, and he was saying that our consciousness is a monstrous denial of the reality of the ecology, because we're so fundamentally inept at getting that right. And Stafford Beer also talked about organizations. It's inevitable that the organization it attenuates the information from its environment. It can't not do that. It restricts what it can see. And the thing is that the most lethal danger for an organization then is using the wrong mental model to attenuate that, because then they'll think that they have enough variety to deal with the environment when they don't. Mm-hmm. So all of that kind of makes sense. But I'm also wanting to dig a little bit deeper into the epistemology that you're talking about, because I wonder if it's so simple that we're talking about thinking aligning with the material world, because you can't actually know that material world without having a perspective on it. So in the reality, what you're talking about is comparing two mental models and using DSRP to actually say, well, which is the better one, or is there a third one that can come out of this? I wonder if there's a danger actually in simply calling it the material world, because if you're going to fall into Beer's trap then of assuming that you've got reality, whereas if you're aware that there's two different realities, then that's more helpful. And I just want to throw back on your, sort of draw on your own thinking to reinforce that. So you said that DSRP is not just in the mind, it's in nature. Yeah. And then when you begin to realize you're talking about perspectives in nature, I asked that question of Laura the other day in an online forum. And it's interesting, as she went through what it means to have DSRP in nature, when she got to perspectives, she talked about our perspectives on nature. And that kind of, to me, really highlights that we're talking about different mental models here and not any ultimate reality.
Yeah, so great question. I guess I would be very cautious, as you're wanting to be cautious in one direction. I would maybe be cautious in the other direction, is that I don't think we're comparing two equal mental models. I think we're comparing one mental model to a mental model that's coming out of evidence. We're bumping up against evidence, right? And because if it's just two equal mental models, then we get into this kind of a solipsistic world where nothing is real. And there's definitely real things, and we can test this out very, very easily by, if you have like a desk in front of you, just clear off the stuff and just smash your head down on the desk, and you'll feel reality right on your forehead. And all of us will feel that. All of us will feel reality giving us feedback that the table is hard. And so that's not a mental model. That's reality. That's us bumping up against reality. Now, I agree that we are nowhere near understanding reality in its totality, that our mental models are often wrong about reality, that we're incredibly biased about reality, all that kind of stuff. I agree 100%. But that doesn't mean there's not reality, and it doesn't mean that we can't get closer to reality, and that when we are getting closer to reality, we actually know that we're getting closer to reality because we can test it and we can get the same results, and et cetera. The other piece to your question about perspective in nature, I would disagree with that. I actually read a paper not too long ago of a physicist. And in the paper, they're talking about atoms, single atoms, and how they have perspective. And I thought to myself, wow, that's really interesting, because that's what DSRP predicts. But I thought, there's no way that this guy has this in experimental research. He must be using a metaphor. So I contacted him. I said, I'd like you to be very clear. Are you using a metaphor when you say that every atom has its own unique perspective, an atom, a single atom? Or are you being experimentally material? And he said, I'm absolutely not using a metaphor. They experimentally have perspective. So there is perspective, and we now, for example, know that plants have perspective. Obviously, animals have perspective. There is perspective in the physical nature of the universe, because the universe is a networked phenomenon that knows what it's connected to and knows what it's not. An amoeba kind of knows what it is, and it knows when it runs up to a foreign body. Now, I'm not saying that they have the same level of perspective that we have. They don't experience it in the ways that we experience perspective taking, but they do have their rendition of a perspective, which is, I'm bumping up against something that's not me. I'm bumping up against something that's toxic, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And all the way down to single atoms. So I think I would say maybe Laura didn't answer that part or whatever, but she certainly understands that when we talk about perspectives and DSRP in nature in the material world, we mean that quite literally. It is part of the fabric of the material world.
Okay. Can I just, Sadaf, do you mind if I just come back on one little point and then I'll hand over, let somebody else have a go?
Yeah.
So I wanted to say what I was not saying in the first part was that there isn't a real world.
Mm-hmm.
What I'm saying is we make that assumption that there's a real world and we can make judgments on when we're closer to it or not. And I think that making judgments on it is different from knowing that we're closer to it or not. Because I mean, I go back to Popper on whether we can know that there's always an in principle possibility of new information that will come after the current moment. So in principle, you can't absolutely know, but you can have a pretty good idea and you can have rules for making those judgments. Like, you know, a bigger community of scientists agreeing with it is better than just one person thinking it, those sorts of things.
That's right.
But I'd still, take your example.
Sometimes that's true.
Yeah, well, sometimes that's true. Of course, you can have
sometimes we just have a popularity contest.
Yeah, that is true in the reality of scientific communities.
Right.
But I'd go back to your example of hitting your head against the table. I would still say that is another mental model, but it's one that's a lot more compelling to you. I'll never forget being in a seminar. And there's John Mingers, who's a realist, and he was explaining realism. And there was Alejandro Ochoa, who's a guy from Venezuela, who's kind of anti-realist. They were having this argument. And Mingers said, look, he really got frustrated. And he said, if I fall out of a plane at 10,000 feet and I hit the ground, I'm dead. And that's a reality. And Alejandro turned around and said, no, hang on, I'm a Catholic. From my point of view, once I've hit the ground, that's the beginning of my true life. And so there's always a mental model involved.
There's always a mental model involved. In fact, I'm not sure, many people might not be familiar with the SoCal hoax, but the SoCal hoax was a very kind of important publishing debacle where Alan Sokal, who's a physicist, wrote this kind of absurd paper, purposefully absurd, published it in a postmodernist journal, got it published, and then revealed that it was completely BS, you know, and the journal actually was destroyed as a result of it. And Alan Sokal actually wrote, if you want to transgress the laws of physics, which was what the article was about, transgressing the laws of physics, you're welcome to come to my New York City hotel room and jump out the window. And we can calculate exactly how fast you're going to fall and at what velocity and all that kind of stuff. And I wrote to Alan and I said, Alan, that's absolutely right. You're absolutely right. If I jump out your window, we can measure it. I'm definitely going to die. That's all real. But you say that the cause of death was physics. And what I would say is that you could just as easily determine that the cause of death was believing in the mental model that you could transgress the laws of physics, right? So what's the cause? What's the causality? Is it the mental model that you're going to transgress the laws of physics, or is it the laws of physics? And the point is it's both. And I absolutely agree with that. But you still die, right? Like there's still a reality, right? So, you know, I think we're on the same page on that.
Yeah.
I don't think language serves us very well in debating, like, you know, is it knowledge or is it judgment or is it one mental model or two mental models or whatever. I think what's important is that we have mental models that are flawed. We bump up against shadows of reality that we can rely on when we get enough evidence and enough whatever it is that comes together to sort of make something clear. We do something enough times and it works enough times. Then we can reasonably say that we know something and that there's something real out there. And I think going the other way, which we currently are going, I think that's I don't know. That's not a great direction to go, where there's no reality and it's just anti-realism. So I think it's both. There's mental models and there's reality. And what we're trying to do is navigate the fit between them. I think Hakan, I'm not sure if I'm saying that right.
Yes. Hi. Very interesting lecture, and I was going to be a little bit less philosophical here and go back to this. You presented a picture of an aquarium.
Yeah.
That's the task was to describe as many things that you could possibly think of when you, or did I misunderstand it?
Well, to be very, very specific, the task was describe what you see. It wasn't describe as many things as you see.
Okay.
It was just literally describe what you see. And it's actually an experiment built off of another famous experiment on Eastern and Western thought styles that used a similar set of methodologies.
Yeah, okay. And then you could show by some kind of an experiment that when people use this DSRP, they could come up with much more complex, much more detailed descriptions. But I was thinking about this. To me, at least, this is kind of a very synthetic situation for a human. I mean, what utility do you usually find in just describing something? Most often we have some kind of a purpose. Perhaps if I was informed that, well, here, let's say I'm visiting a forum for aquarists, people that are doing aquariums. Well, and I am informed that, look here is something problematic. I have a massive fish death here in my aquarium. Can anyone see what could possibly be wrong here? Yeah. And that would be... when people get their mind to it, they will look at things like the balance of different species of fish. Maybe they see that this kind of fish doesn't really go well with this fish, or this type of fish really likes much lower temperatures or something like that. I mean, much knowledge goes into it, and perhaps someone looks at it and says that those plants you have in the aquarium, they are not really enough for this amount of fish. Or I'm just taking from the top of my head here. But as soon as I'm presented with some kind of problem, then my thoughts, my way of organizing the information is arranged to, perhaps according to these distinction systems, relationships, perspectives, but a very particular combination of those in order to use my knowledge in order to solve the problem. What is your reaction to this? I mean, a classic concept in systems theory is purpose. There needs to be some kind of a purpose behind the way we are organizing a system. I'm not sure I'm making any sense here, but do you see what I mean?
Yeah, I think you make a lot of good points. I think without getting too technical, when we looked at that graph of what we call the KMMM, the chart of the methods and the condition of knowledge, and Gerald was talking about interview methods and those kinds of things and experimental methods. I think you're absolutely right that there's something synthetic about all experiments, right? Because you're reducing something down to just the essential items of a scenario. That's precisely why validity and reliability and things like that come from having multiple experiments with multiple different methods, including less synthetic methods, et cetera, that all point to the same conclusion. So it's not that you're wrong that there's a certain syntheticness to it. It's that this particular study gets at very, very scalpel level stuff, and it points to, DSRP existing and being effective. another study, which is less synthetic, but more like kind of like a club rather than a scalpel, is also pointing at the same thing. And so we see validity and reliability as a result of those things, as a result of multiple studies pointing to the same thing. So I'll give you an example. In a case study that we did many years ago with students, third grade or first graders, they're asked to, they were exposed to part whole, which is S. And they sang a little song in the classroom, and then they went outside and they saw a big fire truck and saw some firemen in the outside there. And every year they do the same thing, right? They see the firemen, they see the fire truck, they come back inside, they draw pictures of the fire truck, and they build a fire truck out of cardboard and stuff like that. Well, this year we did a little bit different treatment. We gave them the part whole system song, which was just every hole has parts, every part is a whole, and every whole can be a part of a larger whole. That's it. That was the song, basically. And they go out and they look at the fire truck and they use part whole because they were taught this explicitly. They come back in, and this year, in past years, every single picture and every single model that they made had these parts. It had the front, a back, a ladder, a steering wheel, and 4 wheels. Every year, same thing. They build the same thing statistically across groups. The year that we teach them this song, they come back, they've got front, back, wheels, steering wheel, ladder. The ladder's in 3 different segments. It's got cross pieces. There's dials on the side. There's dials by the steering wheel. There's hubcaps. There's bolts. There's all kinds of more stuff. In other words, the model of the fire truck that they built, both in drawings and physically that they built, was more closer to the actual fire truck than the models that they previously built. It had more stuff. So their model, it wasn't a fire truck. I mean, it wasn't a real fire truck, but their model of a fire truck was more elaborate, more sophisticated, more complex, and more like an actual fire truck than ever before. And these are first graders. Does that make sense?
Yeah, absolutely. It points out back to that aquarium a little bit. Describe what you see, and I can easily imagine that if you go through all those DSRP, if I just focus on distinctions, I would find I can talk of many distinctions here.
Many more.
So it's a good scheme to chop up and make mental models, absolutely.
And not only that, but if you change the perspective, then you'll change all the distinctions you make, right? Yeah. So that's the dynamicism.
Yeah, I see.
It's not just that there's D's and S's and R's and P's. It's if you change the P, it changes all the D's and S's and R's. Yeah. If you change an R, it changes the P and therefore changes the D. So it's very, very dynamical.
Yeah. Maybe it's just that I'm so dead set on as a problem solver in all kinds of situations. I love problems and I love to solve problems.
Well, that's really interesting. One of the things that I love solving problems too, but one of the things I'll tell you is that with our grad students, one of the things that we really have to kind of disabuse them of is being problem solvers, because a lot of times problem solving is our first bias. So we really try to get people to understand systems first, and then maybe the problems will come out of understanding the systems. But if we start with a problem-solving paradigm, we often got blocked by that paradigm, by that bias. And even Elon Musk has a way of saying it with engineers, and this happens with systems engineering a lot. Systems engineers are constantly optimizing things that shouldn't exist, right? They're always solving problems, but they're solving problems on things that probably shouldn't have existed in the first place. There was a simpler way, a more elegant way to design it. And so when we get locked into that bias of problem solving, it's a bias too. And that kind of hinges on what Gerald was saying a little earlier. Like, there's always a mental model. And so you really got to peel the onion until that mental model is as thin as humanly possible. and close to reality as possible.
Of course, you shouldn't decide what is the problem from the beginning, but or the most difficult problems I find, they are often solved by changing perspectives, for instance, or changing the way I see the system, what is actually the subsystem and what is actually the super system. So I think those levers, if you could call it that, they are very good to craft different kinds of mental models, that some of them perhaps could be useful in solving a problem, if there is one.
Yeah, I would be very careful about that word lever, though. It's one of my pet peeves, because I think it comes from system dynamics, and system dynamics is a very mechanical way of systems thinking, and it was created by mechanical folks, and it was created by mechanical folks to apply to social folks, and they use the language of mechanism, and they so ironically, as we try to escape mechanistic thinking, we're using mechanistic concepts like leverage. And leverage is a totally different kind of system than a complex adaptive system. A complex adaptive system, the leverage, if you want to use that term, is in the simple rules and the agents, and it's multiplied exponentially. So it's a very different kind of lever than the kind where you have a big long stick and you put it on a rock and you leverage something literally. That's a very different kind of system than a complex adaptive system like thinking or like humans, where what you're changing is the mental models that are replicated in the behavior of the agents that are multiplied times the number of interactions, and then you get an emergent property. That's really different than a lever.
Mm-hmm. Okay, thank you very much for your elaborate answers. I will leave now and leave room for others.
Absolutely. Great questions. All right. Any other questions? I can't see. Gerald, do you still?
Well, I have got another one if you can bear another one.
I sure can.
Right, okay. So we're working together, obviously, and I've also got a collaborator, Rachel Lilly in Birmingham University in the UK, and she's been talking with me a lot about cognitive science, in particular theories of consciousness, that what our consciousness is fundamentally anticipatory. It's not just a reflection of the world, it's what we're anticipating is coming next, which means that what we're actually always have to be aware of is our own agency in relation to the agency of other things around us, other people and things, and the affordances that are around us. And so, in a sense, our mental models are anticipations of where our action in the world is going to take us. And that lines with what the last person who was asking was saying about purpose. Now, that I've realized is quite different to simply saying we're aligning our thinking with the world. We're actually aligning our thinking with where we might want to go next in the world, which is subtly different. And once I'd thrown that way of thinking back onto all the systems methodologies, I realized that every one of them is anticipatory. Even things like systemic evaluation methods that look to the past, they're doing that in order to learn for the future. So I'm wondering if we might need to change the language a little bit, make it a bit more sophisticated around what we're being about our agency in the world rather than just the world.
Change what language?
The language about where it's our thinking in relation to the real world. Actually, it's our thinking in relation to our agency in the world and where next, our anticipation of the world.
Yeah, I personally think that I think you're giving much more credit to consciousness than it deserves. I would define consciousness as simply neurons looking at other neurons. And we have these P neurons or mirror neurons that do that. And, it's just a set of neurons are looking at another set of neurons. And whether or not they're looking at the right neurons or the important neurons or whatever is sort of that's a secondary question. And to say that consciousness is anticipatory is to give credit to that we're focused on some meaningful set of neurons. We might be focused on entirely a non-meaningful set of neurons. And we know that from lots of different studies that are done on consciousness and things like that. So
yeah, no, but that's my point really, that there are so many biases in consciousness, and that's what the systems thinking can help work on.
But I think DSRP is operating on the conscious and unconscious structuring.
Yeah. So I wouldn't disagree with you on that, but but have a look at the stuff on anticipatory and the predictive brain. I mean, there's evidence now actually that the brain it does Bayesian modeling effectively.
It sure does.
It's incredible.
Absolutely. Yeah, it sure does. Yep. Other questions? Johan.
Hi there. Always learn something when I'm listening to you. First, a detailed question. When you have this picture in your background or systems thinking, what would you say it's a difference between systemic thinking and systems thinking as you describe it? So that's a detailed one. And then another reflection I had this time when I saw your examples with the fish and the birds. So a couple of years ago, I read something about the human eye and its cooperation with the brain when you go to an entry to calculate how you should position yourself to be able to not hit the door in some way. And then I also read that in the US, when you go off from a highway, they trigger your mind with how they display the patterns in the road, the distance between the lines. So you get the feeling it's much closer and much faster coming up than it is, able to affect you to slow down. Mm-hmm. That might be the same dynamics as you're describing with the fishes and the birds. Just a reflection.
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. I agree.
And how about the systemic thinking via systems thinking? Is the same?
You know, I hear these things all the time. Maybe somebody's making a good point about all those word salad, but I frankly don't see it as being that different. I think Gerald probably does or something, but to me, it's like, we're hacking through a jungle and we're doing it with a machete, and people are cutting leaves with a scalpel, right? And you're like, we're not really at the level of an understanding of systems thinking and the human brain to start using a scalpel. We're at the level of, club and machete. And we're trying to build a trail, and we're debating whether it ends in an S or ends in an IC. I just don't think we're at that level. So I don't find it all that useful. But I know a lot of people that do debate that stuff all day long. I haven't seen any empirical work that shows that there's some difference. So I guess I would.
That's fine with me. I hear you.
Yeah.
And since I'm on the speaker now, we use the DSRP in my course, as you're aware of, and I think the most effective part is the P part, the perspective. That was really useful for my students. And instead of understanding if there is one reality, I think it's some humbleness to understand that communication is hard. And that might be the most useful thing with understanding different perspectives, to be humble in your effort or possibilities to explain something to another person, or to get in the military way your mission intent throughout to the soldiers. So with just that easy little use of perspectives, that's really valuable for us. So thank you for that part.
Yeah. Yeah, a lot of people go back and forth and talk about which one they like more. And they always ask me, which one do I like more? And I see them as very dynamical. You can't change one without altering the other. And the empirical experimental research that we did shows this. I haven't gone into it today in the great detail, but with high statistical significance, it shows that when we can actually, with scalpel level precision, predict that certain changes will lead to certain other changes in DSRP and actually find it experimentally. So it's very dynamic. So if you find yourself liking one, dig deeper into the other ones, because they're just as powerful as perspective is. And I always say, when you change the way you look at something, the things you look at change. And so what that means is, when you change your perspective, what are you really doing when you're changing a perspective? You're not just moving from one place to another. You're changing all the distinctions you see. You're changing all the way that the part wholes are organized. You're changing the relationships. So really, to talk about a shift in perspective is to talk about a shift in DSR.
Okay. Yeah, thank you.
Yeah. Other questions? We've got about, what, 10 minutes, Sadaf?
Yes. So how do you want to go about this?
Well, what I'll show you is just the quick, I'll give you the quick version of what we call reps and streaks, which is just, the same thing that you'd use when building any habit, which is try to do daily reps and try to do streaks. If you'd asked me 20 years ago what I would recommend to become a systems thinker, my answer would be very different than it is today. And today it really focuses on the daily. A few minutes daily, every day, burning the neurons will get you, within a few weeks, you'll start doing it in very complex ways. And what we found from the research is that there's a lot of questions. DSRP can be, I'm writing a whole book right now with 5 doctoral students called the Mathematics of Innovation. It's very, very complex. It's the most complex network theoretic that exists today, mathematically speaking. So DSRP is more complex and more able to handle what current network theory can handle. So there's no limit to the complexity, but if you're just trying to do it on an everyday basis, these 5 questions come from the research and are the 5 things that you should just practice over and over again. And we do that both in language, which is the questions, and visually, depending on which one. You can do one or either or both. So the first question is, what things am I choosing to see and not see? How are things grouped or not grouped? How are things related or not related? So those are classic D, S, and R questions. And the next question is actually a combo question that we call RDSs, and they're critically important. And that is, zoom into the relationships and distinguish them, and then systematize them, look for part whole structures, right? So we're actually creating RDSs in all the relationships. And if you do that, that has a huge effect on systems thinking. And finally, from what or whose perspective. And this is not happening in order. This is happening kind of in a simple rules fashion. But if you get good at doing these 5 things, it's kind of a Pareto rule, like an 80-20 rule. You'll get 80% of the benefit for 20% of the work if you get good at these 5 things. Now, if you want to get really, 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 really sophisticated and solve really technical issues, then that 20% is going to take 80% of the work. But these 5 questions will really get you there. And it's just a matter of practicing. We have a thing called System Thinking Daily, which we put out a little practice thing in this network that we have every day, and people practice them and talk about them. And that really changes the game. I think that's the way to do it. So, you can get a training and understand the concepts. And that would have been what 20 years ago, I would have said, do that, like just understand the concepts. But today I would say do that, and then practice 3 to 5 minutes a day, for a few weeks. And pretty soon you'll just see it everywhere, and it'll be everywhere because it is everywhere, and you'll start getting good at it. And it really is just kind of muscle memory. But in the neurons. And that's it. It's that simple.
Thank you very much. Then I open up again. Any new or additional questions, comments? Me, you're raising your hand.
Hi, Derek. Thank you for a very interesting presentation.
Sure.
I'm glad that you brought up dual systems theory. I'm very interested in that too. In particular, how we can use it for design and designing technologies and things. So I wonder, have you written anything like a paper or something where you sort of align these two? I think that you responded very good to Anita's question about it, but have you published any papers or so?
With which two? With design thinking?
No, where you sort of align this RP with dual systems thinking. I mean, Kahneman's and others' idea about two sort of patterns of thinking, fast and slow.
Yeah, no, that's really the where we're heading with a lot of our research, is to look at an empirical basis for what we've seen anecdotally and in cases and in a lot of other types of research, interviews and things like that. But we really haven't done an experiment yet that shows that, well, I'm sorry, Hakan had a good point of the synthetic nature of it. To create an experiment in a very live kind of setting where you show the efficacy and speed. We haven't quite done that yet, and I think we'd like to move in that direction, where it's more sort of natural processing, real world context, and through repetition we show speed and accuracy. That would be those would be great studies to do if you're interested in that. That's where we're headed. Okay.
And so to the next question, have you published things where you relate this to design and how to use this kind of thinking in design work?
Yeah, we've worked a lot in design thinking. It's kind of one of my pet peeves, design thinking. But we've worked a lot with some of the top design thinking folks, and we work a lot in design thinking. I've come to the conclusion that design thinking, and I think most great designers don't think design thinking is a stepwise process. It's obviously like a complex process. But I think design thinking without systems thinking, DSRP, it's like a shark without teeth. You know, like the teeth of design thinking is systems thinking. You can't do good design thinking. Like, as an example, if empathy is one of the steps or the first step, customer empathy in design thinking, well, you can't do true empathy without really understanding perspective and understanding it in a way where you're not just putting your perspective on the customer, but you're seeing literally what the customer sees, the distinctions customers make, the part whole structure that customers care about, the relationships that customers see. You know, you're not going to be able to have that level of empathy without a thorough analysis in that way. So that's just one example of, I think design thinking is kind of like an empty bottle and we fill it with systems thinking.
Thank you.
Gerald.
Yeah, just a quick last one. I wondered if you could say something about the role of emotion in this, because I'm just thinking that we know now that cognition and affect are always interconnected, and we interpret our affect as emotions. So, I mean, you emphasize a lot of the cognitive performance, but how does that relate to emotion?
I think that's spot on. And I always say words kind of fail us, so often. It's why I worry about the name systems thinking. Even cognitive complexity isn't great. When we talk about the field of cognition, we're not talking literally about thinking cognition. We're talking about cognition, emotion, and conation, or motivation. So we're talking about the kind of that three-legged stool of the human experience, right? Motivation, emotion, and cognition. And those things are always kind of at interplay. DSRP is happening in emotional experience. You can distinguish emotions through an emotional state. DSRP is happening on your tongue. You're distinguishing tastes. It's happening in your ears. You're distinguishing oral sensation. So DSRP is not just like literally thinking, cognitive happening in the neurons. It's happening on the surface of your tongue. It's happening in your emotional system. So it absolutely includes all of that. And we wrote a paper on this called, I can't remember the name of it, Psychosocial Implications of Something or Other, some complicated title, that I can send if people are interested in that. But absolutely critically important. You can't remove emotion from the landscape of humanity. That's emotion's half the reason why we're biased, right? So if you remove that, then you're kind of not understanding anything.
Thank you. We don't have many minutes left now.
I just want to add, I laughed, I smiled to myself when you said design thinking is like an empty bottle. We just fill it with system thinking. I will use that quote from you. Thank you.
That doesn't mean the bottle's not useful. The bottle is the container.
Yeah.
I'm not saying design thinking is not useful. I'm just saying like you got to fill it with something.
Yeah.
It doesn't make itself.
I think that's very nice. And it's also one perspective.
Yes. No, I'm sure lots of people would be upset at me for saying that.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Any last final comments or something you would like to say before?
Me?
Yeah, you or if anyone else in the audience.
I would just say systems thinking, the world needs systems thinking, but it needs it to be accessible and it needs it to be technically capable. So a lot of the stuff I said at the beginning, I probably should have said that at the end, but the stuff at the beginning I think is really important, that we as a field need to take things, point things in a much more sophisticated direction, I guess. So I hope we can, as a field, start to do that, because there's a lot of people out there that are counting on us, and if we don't, then that would be sad.
Yeah. Yes. Then I have to say, I definitely agree with you. Everyone, the whole world needs systems thinking. And I want to say again, thank you very much for a very interesting talk and for being with us today for this event.
Absolutely.
I'm looking forward to continue following your work.
Yes, absolutely. Thanks. And sorry I got the time wrong, and I probably look like hell, but anyway.
No, it was very fair. Thank you very much. And thank you everyone attending.
Recording stopped.
Thank you.
Take care, everyone.
Thank you, everyone.
Bye.
Bye.
Bye bye. Thank you.
Thank you.